Welcome, everyone. This is the session Sass Breakpoints plus responsive images plus panels equals responsive web design utopia, right? That's what we're going for, at least. And the caveat is that this is still a work in progress. This is not something that is even live. It's something that we just recently developed, a media current for a client that we love that we're working with. And so this is something that I'm just so excited about that I wanted to share it even before it's done. So I hope you'll bear with me and just kind of enjoy like my creative exploration, but it could be weird. So you could walk out of here thinking that was stupid, but just come and tell me afterward, like quietly. Okay, so my name is Kendall. Let's see if this will work. Nope, it won't. How do I forward this? There we go. Okay, I'm Kendall Totten, and I work for Media Current. And you could follow me on Twitter at Kendall Totten. I used to be Starry Eyes, for those of you that know me as a throwback. I'd like to start out by telling you a little story. Once upon a time, in a land called Atlantia, there once was a client whose website needed a lot of flexibility when it came to building individual pages on their site. The content editors needed to be able to change a lot of the panel page layouts, and the content itself varied a lot. And it needs to be responsive, because all of the good people of Atlantia love their mobile devices, and in all the surrounding kingdoms as well. So I got to work building flexible panels layouts. And I remembered that Panoply, which I saw a presentation on at a last Drupal camp, Panoply distribution has a lot of responsive layouts already. So I took some cues from what they were doing, and all was well in the land, until I noticed this weird image float problem. And unless you're using only full-width images everywhere on your site, then at some point you too will have to face up to the image float problem. If you only give your images a percentage-based width, somewhere along the way your images start to look tinier than they should be. And so I know this is a mobile phone, but we can still make these images bigger than this. This is a snapshot from the Panoply demo from their website, and can you even tell what's going on in this little image? If this was on your phone, you still wouldn't be able to tell what's going on. It's just very tiny, because it's set to only 25% width of the container. And side note, this is not a bashing of the Panoply distribution. It's really cool. You should go check it out. And I totally stole ideas from them, and they're awesome. So maybe someday we'll incorporate this together. It'll be cool. So even worse, if your images are allowed to be their natural width, or maybe if you just set a max width on them and float the images, you'll inevitably get some kind of like weird text wrap effects, and it could be kind of awkward. Nobody wants that. But what about breakpoints? We love responsive design. We love breakpoints, right? Media queries, BFFs. They're the crux of responsive design. So why not just use breakpoints to solve all of our problems? Well, as a themer, this situation requires that we know several variables. We need to know how big are the images, how big is the panel region, and how big is the browser viewport. And the media queries themselves only help us to know C. So the content editors are really in control of A and B, and if we're giving them the flexibility to design their pages how they really want to design them, then we don't really know how big the panel regions are that they're working with, and the panel panes and all that, and the images themselves. What shall we do? Well, you all knew where this was going, right? Sass to the rescue. Sass is going to help us do the hard work of figuring out what that magical breakpoint should be based on the image size, based on the panel pane size, and based on the panel region size. And then also the browser size, which is ultimately what we're going for and how we're roping this all into a breakpoint. So this formula here, as crazy as it looks, is taking all of these variables and plus a few more into account, and we're basically reverse engineering the breakpoint number, because we don't really know what that number is, right? There's too many things that are unknown. So we're going to kind of calculate backwards, and we're going to give the pieces of content on our page special classes so that we can kind of hook this into the CSS. It's crazy, I know, but bear with me. So you can use this formula, and you can tweak a few variables to your liking, either on a per panel page basis or globally. Things like how much room do you want on the right side of your image before you want to start allowing text to float off to the side so you don't get that weird, awkward rivers of text. Or how much padding do you want between the image itself and the text. So easy stuff. And so here's an example of just the panel variables that you would need to worry about. So you don't have to worry about any of that other complex, crazy mix-in, just these, which this is much easier, right? You can handle this. So we can then take that breakpoint formula, and we're going to plug it into every combination of panel region widths, panel pane widths, and image widths. So we're kind of we're building this solution, and this is just a snapshot of what the whole big snippet of Sass looks like. But each time we include the mixin, it has a different combination of variables that match the combination of selectors. So you can see as I'm toggling through here, I'm matching, width 25 with width 25, or image small with image small. So each time I'm including this breakpoint, see those variables are changing. So I'm basically, there's probably a better way to do this actually. Like I know that Sass is brilliant enough that there's probably like some kind of crazy formula out there, but this was already so complex enough, my brain was exploding. So I'm like, I'm just gonna do it this way for now. So somebody out there who's super smart, you can volunteer to help me rewrite this in a better way. So isn't that a lot of CSS? Yes it is. But when you have to leave some pieces of your equation up in the air for your content editors to decide on a per page basis, you have to account for all the possible combinations of things that they might do on that page. So we're going to end up with a lot of code. So what about all those media queries? We're not just talking about regular CSS, we're talking about media queries here, right? So doesn't that affect performance? Well, not as much as you might think. In fact, the person who wrote the Sass Breakpoint extension the Sass Compass extension called Breakpoint, Sam Richard is one of the co-maintainers. He said, we hashed out whether or not there were performance implications of combining versus scattering media queries. And so what we're doing, in my example at least, is we're scattering media queries throughout the code. So they came to the conclusion that the difference, while ugly at best and minimal at worst, is essentially non-existent. I just said that really weird. It's minimal at worst and essentially non-existent at best. So for those of you that actually want to see benchmark results, like you want to see, all right, let's put this to the test and find out how much of an impact, like in the millisecond level, this is actually going to have on your page. There is a breakpoint test out there that they did for the breakpoint module for basically benchmarking. How many media queries does it take to have an effect on your page? And based on my test with using this little Aaron Jensen media query test here, it looked to me in Chrome that between every 1,000 media queries, we're adding about somewhere between 0.5 and 1 second of load time. But that's before caching. So we're talking about a whole lot of media queries before you actually see an effect. And then plus, once you roll up the caching and everything like that, we're really talking about a very small impact. And again, there's going to be some trade-offs when we're trying to build a solution to make things really complex and easy for our content editors. So this all sounds really good. But what about the fact that your panel region widths change size at different breakpoints? So on a desktop size, you may want 3 columns, but on a mobile phone, you may want just 1 full width column and maybe 2 half-size columns. So we need to account for all of those different kinds of layouts, yes? How many of you just went to the Singularity session by Dustin? Yeah? Okay, good. So you know all about how Singularity rocks and how we're going to utilize it here. So I actually use Singularity all the time to build regular layouts. I use Omega 4 as my base theme, and so there's no reason why you can't apply it to panel layouts as well. They're just regions on the page, just like Drupal regions. So you can specify your breakpoints, and you can specify your panel layouts using the Singularity grid system, and you can start defining your region widths per breakpoint, like this. So as I'm going down here, you can see I'm defining 6 columns on my tablet breakpoint, and then 8 columns on my desktop. And it says 12 columns at the top because that's for mobile, and so basically that just means it's spanning the full width of the page. I'm taking up all of the 12 columns. And my next slide. So then I just tack on a few of my fancy image grid mix-ins, that's kind of what I'm calling them at the moment, all that crazy formulaic stuff you saw a minute ago, for each panel region as needed. So I'm starting to build them in here just for the number of regions that I need. So you notice I'm actually using like an 8-column grid span and a 12-column grid span. So those are the only image grid mix-ins that I need to include, the image grid 12 and the image grid 8. And this is going to help us to reduce some of that unnecessary CSS. So we don't need to output all of the grid span mix-ins if we're not using them, right? If our panel regions are only going to be a certain width. So what we're actually doing here is we're building out a series of panel layouts for our client to choose from. So they're not building the panel layouts, because anybody who's ever used the flexible panel layouts builder, you know it can be really complex, kind of challenging, and you end up with a lot of crazy divitis, and your code's kind of all over the place. And it's percentage-based grid width. So this is a much more simple, straightforward solution, and it actually takes a lot of the work out of the content editor's job. They can just choose the panel layout that's closest to what they want to do, and then they can customize from there. And my slide stopped advancing. Uh-oh. There we go. Wait, come back. Okay. But wait, there's more. So this all sounds fantastic, right? But what about the people that are building out the panel pages? How do they actually control this stuff? They're the ones that we're doing this all for, right? We do it all for the client. So what here we're looking at is a snapshot of those panel layouts that I was just talking about. Basically, we went through the site and we decided to mimic the existing content layouts and build panel layouts to resemble those. But then the content editors can go through and they can change the panel width size the panel pane width size. So the regions are predefined, the panel panes are the things that they're changing. And they're doing this through a panel pane plugin. So has anybody heard of the panel styles plugin before? Nobody? Oh, a couple? Media current people? Okay. So this already existed, it's panel styles, and what it was loosely used for, at least in the examples, were things like, let's add some rounded corners to your panel panes, or let's add a background color, which kind of sounds fun, but it's a little fluffy, and it wasn't really particularly useful. So I decided, what if we actually start roping in the widths, the classes that are controlling the widths, and use this panel styles integration to do that. So one of my highly esteemed coworkers, Jason Smith, stand up, Jason. Yay, okay. Jason wrote a fancy panels plugin that's going to help us make this even better. And my other fantastic coworker, Derek Duraps, are you here? Yay, stand up. Yay, Derek. He made it so that we didn't have to hack panels to do it, so that's good. Because what we really want to do is we want to make it so that when you're a content editor and you're choosing the width of your panel panes, you want to be able to see what you're doing right within the editor, right? You don't want to have to keep saving, going back to the front of the page. So this is really the ideal here. You're being able to apply the width of your panel panes through the little config, and you can see it in action. So what we're looking at here is two panel panes that are side by side. See this one about kittens here and this one about kittens there. Those are both set to 50% width through the style. So the person actually can go and just click on the gear icon and choose 50% width, and that's what happens. They see it live on the page. So that's pretty cool. This gives us a good visual indicator of what it's going to look like before we even save it. And you can also override your image styles here too. So you can see I have panel pane width, and then I have image size override. And this is also an important part of the magic, because what we're really trying to do is making sure that our images can be as large as possible. So whatever the largest starting point of your image is, maybe it's 600 pixels, maybe it's 200 pixels. We want to make them as large as possible for the device size without getting any of that awkward text wrapping, making sure there's enough space for text to go around the side when possible, right? So if I'm a content editor and I have a, what does that say, 320 pixel wide image. If I have a 320 pixel wide image or maybe a 350 pixel wide image, I'm going to pick the next closest style to hook into. And right now I only have about 4 basic styles, but you could absolutely add more than that if you needed to. And I'm going to choose that one, and that's going to grab all that lovely CSS and pull it in per panel region and per breakpoint size. So this is a snapshot again showing you kind of the image styles that I've predefined here. And I actually chose to put the numbers right inside the dropdown because who's going to remember what image large is? Nobody's going to remember that. So if you were to go in and actually edit these and change them for your particular site, you would want to go into the little configure, I don't know what you call it, the panel style module that you wrote. It does live inside the theme. It's not a true module. But you would want to go in there and actually change the text there if you're going to do this, because this is all for the content editor. So we want to make sure that's accurate. You would also want to change the Sass variables that dictate the width of those images. So image small, image medium, image large. And if you wanted to add more of them, you could feel free to add more variables. You would have to go in and add those into that big, giant span. But again, if somebody helps me write a better way to output that, then it could be easier. So good. And then, of course, you also want to match it to your Drupal image styles, right? And you're all thinking about that in the back of your head, like, well, how does this work? So ideally, what I would like to do is be able to tie the two together so that you select one thing. I just say image medium, and it does two things. It pulls in the Drupal image style that's related to it, and it also pulls in the CSS classes assigned to it. There are multiple ways to do this that exist right now. I just haven't been able to rope them in yet because I know the the media module allows you to output classes that match your image style. So if you define the image style in Drupal and you're using the media module, it can spit out a class that's similar, and that's exactly what we want. And you could just override it from the panels editor. So ideally, you don't want to actually have to do this in the panels editor. You don't want to have to tell every image how big it needs to be, because that's a lot of legwork. You want to be able to define it in the view. You want to be able to define it, in the content type, where you usually do. But this just gives the content editors a quick way to override it if need be, because it'll always be more specific when they do it from the panels interface. So selecting one of the image styles just adds the class, like image small or image large, onto the panel pane div. And our Sass generated styles make use of that. So let's see here. This is basically showing you the markup. And the div class here, image medium that I'm pointing to, that's something that I, as the site builder, have injected like through one of the ways that I mentioned, through views or through your content type, something like that. You're just basically putting the class on there and saying, this is the size image that we're using here. If you're a content editor and you apply one of the styles, it's going to apply it on the pane content level. And so again, like it'll override it. It'll have more specificity in your Sass. So it'll take precedence. And by the way, the image styles that we are applying via panels only control the CSS. So not only do you want to use image or Drupal image styles, you also want to do something for adaptive images. You don't want to skip over that very important part. You want to make them really responsive for your site, and there's a lot of great modules out there that can help you do that. Adaptive images is the one that I like and I've had a lot of success with, but there's Borealis and there's client-side adaptive image and a handful of other ones. So don't skip that step, even though you could Prancer size. Don't skip. Cheesy, I know. So I want to show you the actual site here. And this is tricky because I have a hard time seeing the screen. There we go. Okay. Grab the edge. Okay, so this is my responsive site here, and you can see I've got some big images and some small images. And what I want you to notice is when I'm dragging the size of the window across, as soon as it gets to a point where there's not really enough room for text to start wrapping around the image, it actually drops down below the image. So the image is no longer, it doesn't have float characteristics anymore. So if I bring it back out and there's enough space, because I've chosen, I said the magic number is 120 pixels. That's how much space I want to have next to my image before I start wrapping text. And then I bring the window in and there's not enough space for it anymore, so it jumps back down. So then if I scroll down here, you can see like the tiny image will do the same thing. And it jumps back down. So pretty cool, right? Eh? I'm crazy, maybe? And let me show you what the panels interface looks like since I yabbered on so much about it. So if I go in and edit the panel, ignore the warnings, they don't mean anything. Jason says so. So I can click on the gear icon, and I already have the style set to panels grid, and that's the name of this custom plugin that we wrote. That's the style itself. So you'd always choose panels grid as the style. But you could just change the settings for that style, which is where all this good stuff comes in. So you could choose the panel width. I could set it to be 25% width. And as long as there's enough space for your panel panes to sit side by side, they will. So you don't have to worry about anything like telling them to float because they're already floating or clearing the floats. The one thing you would want to be cognizant of is if you have multiple panel panes that are floating like in rows, you may want to actually put those in separate panel rows so that you add in that clear float. Because otherwise, when they get to be different heights, you're going to kind of get some weird floating action. They're going to try to fill in the little bit of space underneath the one over here. It's going to get weird. So put in some extra panel regions. And if you put in PHP that just tells your panel regions not to output if they're empty, then it's okay. You could have like a dozen panel rows sitting in your layout, and they don't hurt anything. They're not being used. So that's what we did. But we also, just for fun, I do have some drop-downs in here that you could change the float left and float right. I do have a clear float in here, but I figured that this is more like for my themer brain, but content editors aren't really going to understand why they're clearing a float. So that's probably going to go away. And then I do have the image layout here, which I could just set the image to be 100% width. It won't ever stretch your image, but this basically says, stop this whole floating game, just chill where you're at, the text will always drop below the image, good to go. And that's that. So if I save it, you can see right away the panel pane itself is actually much smaller, and the other pane just moved over and filled in that space. And see, those are all those glorious rows I talked about. I'm going to update and save. And And there we go. So now this is much smaller. You can see the image is much smaller as well. And so I haven't done testing to worry about what happens if you just use like giant image sizes and let adaptive images handle all your stuff. I guess the major problem with that would be you still don't want to load enormous images that you're not showing, even on desktop. Even though we kind of assume that desktop users can afford that bandwidth, we still want to be cognizant of just loading the image size that we're going to display. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
I think it's your base theme for this is Omega 4?
It is. It's Omega 4 is the base theme that I'm using. Yes. So Omega 4, for those of you that haven't heard, that's the hot new word on the street. If anybody knows me from older Drupal camps, I was always a big Omega 3 super fan, and I always presented on it and talked about it and raved about it. Omega 4 is just that much better. It's like night and day from Omega 3, so if you loved Omega 3 too, you're going to have to like take a deep breath before diving in and exploring it, because what it does is it gets rid of the entire interface to lay out your site.
But then panels takes that place, right?
Panels can take that place, but the assumption is that you're going to use something like Singularity Grid System or Suzy to lay out your site. Because really the power is being able to do it super fast in the code. And so having done both now, it does take a little bit of learning time, and that's like anything in Drupal or web design in general, right? It takes a little bit of time on the front end to learn the skill, but once you start doing it, it's fantastic. And you're like, this is so amazingly fast. I can't believe, I never want to go back to that clunky interface and start clicking around, and it becomes a pain. So choose your weapon, Singularity or Suzy, either one. I think that Omega 4 did ship with Suzy originally, and I think now the maintainer, Sebastian Simpson, is now switching over to Singularity, and that's my favorite. But it's up to you. You can use either one. So good. Anybody recognize this? Yay. Good. Homestar runner. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so you all want to know, how do I make this happen on my site? I'm glad you asked. So like I said, I want to continue to improve this idea and make it work better with the media module and things like that. So this is kind of still a work in progress, but what you can do is you can download this sub-theme that I've made, in a sense, and it's kind of a stupid name. It's called Panelitas, because that's the coolest thing I could think of at the time. And you can download it and install it in the same, just your site's all themes directory right alongside Omega 4. And it is built on Omega 4. So in this case, you don't have the option to use something else like Aurora or whatever. You do have to use Omega 4 for this particular sub-theme. And you want to install some cool stuff on your system, like a version control manager for your Ruby gems and bundler, because Omega 4 is so advanced and mind-blowingly awesome that it uses and takes advantage of a lot of cool Ruby gems, like Sass and Breakpoint module and a whole host of other things. Singularity is another Ruby gem. So the cool thing is you don't have to go and install all those individually. When you download the Omega 4 theme and you get your Ruby gem manager in place and bundler, you just say bundle install, and it installs all the Ruby gems for you, and it installs them just on a per project basis. So in fact, if you're already using Sass or any of the gems out there, it won't affect your other projects, which is fantastic news, because version control can get crazy even within the gems themselves. So you don't want your projects clashing. So this is a great system to take care of that problem. And then you run the guard command to begin compiling your Sass, and it just watches it. So what that means is when you're working in your Sass code, every time you hit save, it compiles all of your Sass for you and outputs the CSS. And has anybody here never used Sass before? This is an advanced session, so I figured maybe we'd have a good percentage. But that's okay. If you haven't used it before, your Drupal site's not using the Sass. It's only using the CSS. Sass is a tool for you as a themer to make your life easier and make you write better code and more streamlined code. And you can do crazy stuff like this. So it's really good. And so I know I'm a little bit early by about half hour. So what I can do at this point, I wasn't sure how long this would take me, but I talk really fast. So I can start demoing code. I can show you like actual code if anybody wants to see it, or we can just like have a cool Q&A session for half an hour. Do you have a question?
See more about Sass itself.
Okay. Anybody else had any questions about any stuff before I dive in? Yeah.
This is awesome. When do you think you're going to be done with it?
Well, that depends. Jason, you know the answer to that, right?
Just noted if that is the client.
Right.
It's already done.
Okay, can you guys see this? Is the resolution okay in the back of the room? Is this like helpful? I can't see it, but I'm going to try. Okay, let's do this. Okay, so what we're looking at here, this is kind of your fundamentals where you start in Sass. This is the breakpoints, and you generally want to start by defining these. This is like where your site starts shape-shifting and things for like, your smartphone, your tablet landscape view, and desktop. So these numbers are totally flexible, and you can always go back and change them too, which is the nice thing, because anytime we're going to refer to a breakpoint in our code, we're going to refer to it by the variable. So we only have to change this in one place when we decide to change our minds later, and instead of making it 750, we decide to make it 775 for whatever reason. I've also got a handful of other things. This is just for me to be lazy and not have to type in stuff every time. So I can just use a variable for when I want to do the smartphone portrait max width. And because Sublime auto-completes things for me, so like again, Sass is your tool, make it what you will. But this doesn't hurt anything. This is just outputting the basic breakpoints for me. And I am using the breakpoint module. So I can't see. Okay, these are the things I showed you a snapshot of earlier, where I have my image variables for image small, medium, large, and extra large. And again, you can always go back and change those. So if you are downloading this sub-theme and you want to try it out, and you want to make it work for your site, and you want to make it match the existing Drupal image styles you already have, you would want to go in and change these variables. And you don't have to change anything in the scary, weird formula, just the variables, which is good news. And then also in the panels, I need a word for what the thing that you wrote. Plugin. Panels plugin. You want to change it there too? Yes.
So your sub-theme has the Sass files?
Yes. Yes. Has the Sass files, built on Omega. Just make sure you've got all your gems installed, and it should work beautifully, I think. If it doesn't, ask Jason. Okay, so let's see here.
So you're installing those dependencies, the Ruby dependencies in your themes directory, so it's all there?
Yeah, so he has to find installing the Ruby dependencies in my theme. That's what Bundler is doing for me. So I do have to manually make sure I have a Ruby version control manager set up and Bundler installed. And then for any project, you just hit bundle install. If it has a couple things like a gem file, the gem file will list out all of the Ruby dependencies that the project needs and the versions. And so you just hit bundle install and it takes care of it for you. Okay, so this is going to get a little weird. So back when I was showing you that formula and I was saying what we're doing is reverse engineering the breakpoint, what I decided to do was to break down the panel pane widths into some basic numbers. So like 25% width, 33%, 50, 66, 75, 100. Our content editors don't get to choose like arbitrary numbers like 47.2. That would be too complex and difficult for us building the code. So I've just got those 6 numbers to deal with. And what I want to know is, what do I have to multiply it by to go backwards in time and say, if my panel region is only 50% width of the page, what do I have to multiply by to get back to 100% width? Because that's really what we're looking at. We're trying to get the breakpoint for the whole browser width. So we're trying to figure out that 100% width. So this is some like algebraic formula stuff where I've just added some basic variables for those numbers, and those plug into that formula. So I can go back here so you can kind of see, because every time I call it up, I say grid width inverse or pane width inverse, and then I'm multiplying by those numbers. Okay, and then I've got, these are just some basic mix-ins for me to use as I'm writing code. If I want to include a quick width 50%, I can just type in the mix-in instead of having to type that all out. And let's see, what's this? Okay, this is the Sass file for the actual panel layout. And my panel layouts are named for cities. This is nyc.sass. And what I'm doing here is I'm defining, like, let's look at the left rail. This is my region called left rail. And the mobile grid span is 12 columns. It spans the full width of the site. But then as I move down into the breakpoint for tablet portrait, I've decided to make it only 2 columns wide. So that's good. And then I move down here, and what I decided to do is include the image grid 3 for some reason. Why did I include 3? That's not right. That should be right. Like I said, work in progress. So if I'm including a grid span of 2, that's the only number I'm concerned with. So ideally, I would love to build a whole bunch of panels layouts kind of the same way that Panoply has done and kind of just put those out there so you don't have to come in and tweak these things. But really, we're all like super advanced themers here, so we can come and create our own panel layouts because you want to do something custom for yourself or for your client. So this is not too hard. If you take a little bit of time to learn Singularity, this is a quick jump just to add the image grid mix-in that just matches your Singularity mix-in. And then moving down here, I've got a grid span of, why do these numbers not match? Shoot. It's supposed to match, your number here, grid span 10 and image grid 9. I think it's because I was tweaking it before when I was demoing and I was just showing how you could change numbers, and I think I didn't change them back. So they should match. And again, this is going to help you to reduce the amount of output that you're ending up with in your CSS. So if you want to see what the CSS actually looks like, it looks like this. It's a lot of it. It looks kind of scary to those of us who've written CSS, and you wouldn't want to handwrite all of this, of course. There's a lot of media queries here. But Sass is doing all this legwork for us and writing all these arbitrary numbers, like at 826.35 pixels. That's a good time for a breakpoint. But only if we're in the header region and the panel pane is 75% width and the image is large. But you would never know that, but Sass can do it for you. So, any questions now that I've shown you this and you're like,
How long did it take you to master Sass?
Sass was a quick dive in. I don't know if there's a good way to say you've mastered Sass, because as soon as you feel like you have a good handle on it, there's just more stuff to learn and more crazy stuff you could do with it. I don't think I know everything there is to know about Sass, but if you've never used it before or you're just kind of new to it, it's really easy to jump in and just start using it for really basic stuff, like create a variable for that color hex code you can't remember, or create a mix-in for every time you have to write your font family stack, and there's like 27 fonts. So just write a mix-in for that. So it's much easier. What you're doing is just increasing or decreasing the amount of time that you have to sit writing code, and you're helping yourself. And then you can start diving in and doing complex mathematical equations. You can write like if statements and for loops and like real programmer stuff. So you can kind of like give the developers an evil eye across the room. You're like, I'm doing this stuff too. Okay, so then this is what I showed you a snapshot of. This is the actual stuff that I wrote for all those panel mix-ins that I need help with. Somebody needs to help me make this better. So if you do consider yourself a Sass master, help me write some kind of formula that generates this for me. So in my case, if I did want to go through here and add in a new image width, like if I want image extra small, I would have to go in here and add it into each one of these. But I use Sublime Text Editor, so that makes it really easy, because you can edit multiple lines at once. Did you guys know that? If you select something, you hit Command-D, it'll select all the instances of it. So then you can like select stuff across the row. Let's see if I can do it. What was that? I have hecklers, that's cool. So anyways, it's not that bad once you kind of get into it, but yeah, this is a lot of code. But again, we're not including all of this on every panel region, so we're reducing the amount of CSS we're writing. Let's see what else I got. Oh, this is the plugin that Jason wrote. So this is if you wanted to come in here and actually edit anything about this. Like for example, I have it set so that the default panel pane style is width 100%, which makes sense to me. But maybe you want to change that, so you could come in here and change the defaults. If you wanted to add new image breakpoints, you could come in here and just copy one of these lines and change the numbers and the names as you will. Anything else you want to add about this plugin? Jason's content to quietly watch. Yeah?
Is the plugin available in the...
Yeah, it's part of the sub-theme. So Jason originally wrote it to be a module, but I wanted it where I could control it and be the master puppeteer. So we put it into the sub-theme, which I think works because, like I said, I'd like to really bundle this up and make it maybe an extra sub-theme you can download on Drupal.org for the Omega 4 theme. Right now, I don't know if there's any other ones out there besides Ohm. That's kind of like a demo theme, just so it looks a little bit nicer when you first install it. But I don't think it's pretty new, so I don't think there's any other sub-themes out there. So I feel like this has a little ways to go, but we're going to make it awesome and better, and then hopefully put it somewhere where everybody can get it. So this is in a sandbox on Drupal.org. So let me go back to that link. So these two links at the bottom here, one of these is for the slides. That's the RWD Utopia. And then the second bit.ly link is Panelitis. Again, sorry about the name. And that's for the sub-theme that you can download from the sandbox.
It's pretty cool.
Anybody else? Oh, yeah.
I'm not familiar with Sass at all, but when I was reading of Sass, it's got for loops, each, while, etc. With that in mind, can't you throw all of those different specific widths and particular sizes, small, medium, large, 25, 35, etc. into an array or a set of arrays
I hope, right, so he's talking about the for loops within Sass. Sass does have the capability to do that. And yes, you're totally right, and I tried to do it. The reason I couldn't do it, and I don't know if it's just me, but let me go back to the, nope. Hold on, we're almost there. Did I skip it? I can't see these at all.
Panels, grids.
There we go, that one. Okay. The reason why I couldn't write a for loop for it is because this mixin itself, the image breakpoint mixin, actually is outputting a media query inside of it as part of the content that we're spitting out. So you can't, right now, you can't concatenate your media queries. You can't, comma delimit them and put them together. And so that was hurdle number one. And hurdle number two was each one of the breakpoint mixins, or each one of the image breakpoint mixins, had to have a different variable to match the classes that contain it. So I couldn't think of a way to put it was like the matrix. Like I couldn't get it in my head in a way to like be able to output some complex code. But this is not, this was like pushing it for me. So maybe you can help me.
I wasn't sure if it gets like dollar width equals the dash degree, rather than the dash, the 30 degree, the numeric portion could be a second variable, or if that's not possible. Maybe talking about concatenating a variable on the fly. I don't know if that's possible.
Are you talking about making the classes over here into variables?
No, not
Or-
the passing itself, the actual parameters you're passing into the actual,
Yeah, those are variables right now.
right, but you're naming your variables the way that you want them to be, as opposed to naming them, because you put those into an array that you then pass into, I have no idea what I'm saying.
I think you're on the right track. I don't know if you can do an array, like a full array, that you could in a normal programming language within Sass. But Sass is constantly evolving, and they're always adding like new cool stuff to it. So I think it's maybe only a matter of time till it gets pushed to that limit where you can write a really complex array statement that I can output this stuff for you. In the meantime, I felt like I only had to do this once, and you only have to come in here and tweak it if you need to. But this is just one big heap of code that just does all this legwork for you. So to me, it wasn't that bad that I had to, because this doesn't go anywhere. This is just for us to look at because it's in a Sass file. And so the CSS that's output from it is what we're really concerned with. So we could make this a heck of a lot neater, absolutely, and I'd love to, but it doesn't hurt anybody, sort of, by being there. Anybody else? Yeah.
So the part you showed with panels, does that work with the index editor?
It does not at the moment. I just pointed this out to Jason earlier. Do you know why that might be?
We replaced the class that does the display renderer, so it turns out IDE uses the same class. Right now, no.
And sorry, the question was, can you use this custom panels editor plugin that we wrote with the in-place editor, which would be super fantastic because then you could just edit it from the front end. And then we're getting that much closer to kind of that Spark-like awesomeness. So at the moment, no, but.
Well, with in-place editor, you're actually using the front end renderer. So
Right.
It works. You just need to save it.
Yeah, so
You just need to save it.
if you can apply panel pane styles, yeah,
Yeah.
to be continued. We shall do it. I thought I saw another question over here. Maybe that was the same question. Anybody else? And I know you guys would be really sad to get out of your session early. Does anybody have any other generic Sass-related questions, or you want?
After you set all that up, how is it that you compile your Sass files into CSS?
That's a good question. So he asked, how do you compile the Sass files into the CSS? And this is my handy-dandy friend Guard, who is running in terminal in the background. And let me exit out of it. So I've already drilled down into my sub-theme. So you can see I'm in Omega 4 is the name of my site. I'm in Sites All Themes. I'm in Panel Leadist. And you can just run the command Guard. Normally you would run Compass Watch from in this directory if you're just doing it the good old-fashioned way and just using Sass and Compass. But I have Guard installed, which is another Ruby gem. So if I run the Guard command, it basically tells me that it's watching that directory, and it will notice if I save any of the Sass files, and it'll compile it to CSS. So it says Guard is now watching, and so if I go back here and save something, and I know I changed some crazy variables, so we'll see if I broke anything. If I hit save, it goes through and outputs all the CSS that it needs to. And all of my Sass files do not have a direct CSS output file. If you write the name of the Sass file with an underscore at the beginning, it means it's a partial, and it doesn't actually have a counterpart CSS automatically. So that means you can have as many Sass files as you want to. You can organize your directories however you want. And in fact, Omega 4 has it already broken up into a bunch of little partials for you. So things like colors and typography and your grid mixins and your breakpoints and all that kind of stuff. Those can all be in separate partial Sass files. And the only ones that you want to output a direct match to, so like your basic theme styles and your panel styles. So you can see I have like New York City or NYC.css, and I have Venice.css, which is another layout. Those have counterparts. And oh, by the way, the panel's layouts only pick up the CSS for that panel layout. So you're not loading all of these media queries all over your site for all the different panel layouts. You're only loading it for that particular panel layout. And again, we're reducing the amount of CSS that way. Anybody else? And the other good thing about having this little friend in the background here is it'll tell you if you output or if you put in something incorrect. And Sass is really picky if you use the Sass syntax .sass as opposed to .scss. The CSS syntax or SCSS syntax, you can use your curly brackets and your semicolons just like you would with regular CSS. So a lot of people prefer that as a way to kind of like get their feet wet in Sass. But I like to do it in the sense that everything is indentation sensitive, or so you basically use an indent to indicate if you're nesting something or you're starting a new line. You have to have proper spacing and all that. So it's a little bit more hardcore, but what that means is you have to write really neat code. You can't have any sloppy code in it. You can't forget to end a line or whatever. You can't forget a semicolon. There are no semicolons. But it basically just means that your code is much nicer for the next person that comes along and has to maintain your crazy stuff. Anybody else? Yeah.
All right, I have an intermediate question. I'm not that advanced.
Okay.
I'm going to throw an intermediate question here. Now, let me get this straight. Obviously, since you're using Sass, it's compiling at the time of development. But Panels is an interactive UI that a user could use after a website has been developed. So if a user goes and picks a panel style from your list of panels that hasn't been compiled in by Sass, when you make the theme, what happens then?
So you asked the perfect question. You should have asked that at the beginning of my session.
I'm
So,
the perfect intermediate.
yeah, if you guys couldn't hear, he's basically said, well, what happens if a user chooses a panel pane width or something that wasn't in your Sass that you wrote? That's exactly why I wrote this, is because I didn't know what they were going to choose. The things I do know is how wide the panel region is, because I wrote the layout for it. I created the NYC panel layout, and I created the Venice layout. So I'm defining the width of the panel regions. That's under my control. So that's why I'm only outputting like image grid 8, because it's an 8-column region, or image grid 6 if it's a 6-column region. What I don't know is which widths they're going to pick or which image sizes they're going to pick. That's why I'm outputting all of that CSS to cover all the bases. So that's kind of the big trade-off here, is that if you are building a system where you have unknown variables that are out of your control, but you want to avoid that image width awkwardness, and you really want your images to be as big as possible on mobile, and you don't want crazy text wrapping stuff, you got to build a little bit outside the box for all possible combinations of scenarios. So yeah, really good question. Yeah.
So what if you don't even want to use panels?
Well, if you don't want to use panels, I mean, you could I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are other ways that you could kind of build in maybe some other editor where you could do a similar kind of thing. I guess panels for us was a great tool in a way that you're giving some of the control of design, and layout and image sizes to your content editors. There's not many other tools that I know of that give that kind of control and visual evidence as they're going along of what they're trying to do. So I felt like for us, at least, for what we were building for, panels was an ideal solution. Because a lot of times I used to compare like panels and display suite as a themer. I was like, well, you could do a lot of stuff with display suite, and maybe you don't need panels and da-da-da. And we've had lots of conversations about that. But display suite is not so friendly for your content editors. If they're going to build a page, they don't want to go through and tweak a bunch of display suite settings, because that's like way more geeky than they bargained for. So they would much rather click a little gear icon and just say, yeah, 50% width or 25% width, or yeah, my image is small or it's large. So I feel like the interface is a lot better for this. And I mean, this was a demo that was a little weird because we were spanning the breadth of, here's some weird stuff you can do with Sass, here's how you can do responsive panels layouts, here's how you can build in this weird plugin that we wrote for it. You know, we're kind of doing a whole combination of things. So I mean, you could just take part of this and apply it to some other piece of your site, you know, just the Sass mix-in that I wrote, you could apply it some other way. But really what I was doing is trying to build for that scenario where people could customize their layout on the fly.
Well, I think this brings up a good point of the difference between Omega 3 and Omega 4, because one of the advantages of Omega 3 was that a web designer could go in and change the widths of columns, but then their settings are being stored in the database rather than in code, which is great because then there's no issue until the themer has to change something to the theme, and now the new theme is out of sync with the database. So that was always the problem with Omega 3. Omega 4 sort of has an opposite problem in that you lose that interactive capability, which you've sort of given back some of it.
Right, and I feel
this approach.
Yeah, and so Ken was comparing Omega 3 and Omega 4, and you know, I feel like this, in a way, I'm actually really eager to talk to the maintainer of Omega 4 about this. He's been super busy, but I feel like this is maybe bridging that divide a little bit, because a lot of the people that loved Omega 3 loved it because it had this editor, and we grew really fond of that, and we're like, yeah, it makes it easy, and I don't have to write like weird Sass and stuff. But Sass is so powerful. We want to harness that. So this is kind of that in-between where, you know, even as a themer, even if you've made that jump and you're doing Sass and you're using Singularity, your content editors aren't going to write it. So if you need to give some of that, you know, theming control or that layout control back, this is kind of a good hybrid place to go.
I'm waiting for some genius module writer to write a module that'll have an interactive UI like Omega 3, that when you set it, the module then writes the CSS out and includes it so that then you have the interactivity and you have the code at the same time.
Yeah, and what you're talking about is like, you know, exporting sort of variables into the Sass code and injecting the code. We've had that conversation too, which I want to explore that. I want to see if that can be done and if that can be harnessed. It would be tremendously powerful. But then you kind of, I guarantee there's going to be somewhere somebody's going to say, but if you're taking it out of the code, then you're putting it back in the UI, then you're taking away like the flexibility that you have in the code, you know. So I feel like you can't have your cake and eat it too unless you buy two cakes. So we're kind of stuck, you know. You got to do it one way or the other. But this is that in-between land where I have a little bit of control as the themer, and I can make some very versatile layouts for people to tap into, but then they can still customize them. So thank you very much, guys.